Is China's Belt and Road Initiative a grand plan for China to contribute to the public good, to global governance, or is it a grand plan for more Chinese influence over other countries? Or is the truth somewhere in between? Well, in this series, I've been discussing the Belt and Road Initiative, and this is the final one in which I'll read from the chapter of my book, A New Era of Risk. And so before I start reading the last section of the chapter on Belt and Road, just to sum up, I guess, that the Belt and Road Initiative was announced with great fanfare by Xi Jinping as one of a series of initiatives that he has outlined over his decade in power, and they are presented to the world as these grand Chinese gestures, the opportunity for China as a rising power to fund infrastructure connectivity to the developing world, built on China's confidence that its model of infrastructure-led development, which was very much influenced by other East Asian models of development as well, a confidence that China holds that this is the answer for each country that is developing, that they need infrastructure, they need connectivity for trade, and they need to be better integrated into globalization. So that's as a general concept strongly held amongst the Chinese elites, that this is a positive contribution they're making. Now, of course, there is an understanding that every country is different and that conditions are different in each country. And so that's why we need to dig deeper into case studies to really understand what's going on. And at the same time as the Chinese language about making a positive contribution to development, we have, of course, as I've discussed earlier, the American narrative, or the Western narrative, if you like, because it's not just in America that we hear this, but we hear a narrative, especially in the English language, that China is engaging in these grand initiatives to somehow trap countries in debt, to have influence over them, and to strengthen China's power at the expense, perhaps, of its partners. So that, of course, is the very pessimistic way of looking at what China is doing. What China is doing is not all that different, in a sense, to the way that the United States, after World War II, supported through the Marshall Plan, rebuilding of Europe, and America outlined with its new Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, a vision for global development in its time when America was the predominant power in the world. Today, the United States is still a very powerful country in the world, but it's not predominant. It's not dominating anymore. And now China is a peer competitor. So it's worth us digging deeper to understand the complexity of the Belt and Road. How is it actually going? It's now a decade or more than a decade old. How is it evolving? And what are the risks? Now, of course, there are risks. There's no doubt there are risks, and I'm going to begin by reading about some of those risks, and there are positives and there are negatives here in relation to the Belt and Road Initiative. So, risks of Chinese-funded projects certainly vary according to local governance practice. This is critical because each government has different approaches, and so there is diversity here on the Belt and Road. This is demonstrated, for example, in the Pacific Islands, a region where there is a divergence of governance, where in some countries, such as, let's for example use a case that was researched in the literature, a case where it was found that Samoa, with its relatively more transparent decision-making and efficient government planning processes that were inclusive as well of different government departments that were transparent, led to quite a successful Belt and Road infrastructure partnership with China, whereas in the case of Tonga, another small Pacific Island country, without the same level of transparency or efficient governance, we might say, as outside observers, in the case of Tonga, a famous infrastructure project funded by China led to diversion of money instead, not to building the roads that it was supposed to be built, but actually building an extension on the King's Palace. In Africa, poor local planning of the Addis Ababa Djibouti freight railway cost the China Export and Credit Insurance Corporation losses of around $1 billion US, demonstrating that actually the risks accrue to Chinese actors as well. Sorry, it's not just the recipient governments or the people in recipient countries, but actually the Chinese actors in the Belt and Road are finding that they're facing risks as well, quite often risks of local corruption and local security issues and other problems that, again, exist across the diversity of the more than 125 countries that are engaged with partnering with China on the Belt and Road Initiative. In Southeast Asia, following the change of government in Malaysia in 2018, the East Coast Rail Link project was reduced in cost by 1/3, which really appears to confirm that there was highly likely to be a very high level of corruption involved in that earlier project as it was developed with very high costs. The same project has been able to go ahead at much lower cost. At the individual project as well, we should take a look at specific individual projects. And in my research, I did that. I looked at many individual projects across the globe. Some Chinese state-owned enterprises, which are often key actors in Belt and Road projects, have no doubt in some cases been exporting some rather poor corporate practices particularly early in the rollout of the Belt and Road Initiative. Some of these firms were in the early stages of internationalisation. They were still learning and they were making mistakes based on exporting the business practices within China, which exhibited some level of corruption. And by the way, there's corruption almost everywhere in the world. So in saying this, I'm not pointing the finger at China alone, but it certainly was the case that some of the early Belt and Road projects exhibited some of these problems. Poor and opaque planning, for example, which we might, on the highest standards of international infrastructure projects, expect that there would be more transparent and better planning. And I think that's been the case much more recently with more recent Belt and Road projects, but it was a risk with some of the early projects, there's no doubt. Inadequate due diligence and limited understanding of local conditions or the need for stakeholder management, the need for community engagement, for example, and characteristically low levels of transparency. All of these indicated that sometimes these big state-owned companies were simply moving to another country and thinking they could just operate as if they were in China. Always a risk for any country, for a big state-owned enterprise or a private enterprise from any country thinking it can just operate according to the standards of its own country. Further, it's been noted in the scholarly literature that Chinese firms and bureaucrats may sometimes be making mistakes in implementing projects because of their enthusiasm to please those in the party-state hierarchy, including grouping increasing numbers of aid and investment projects under the Belt and Road banner, regardless of their contribution to providing important new infrastructure or connectivity or other Belt and Road goals. So in fact, there's a kind of an incentive here for many projects to be lumped under the Belt and Road, and this is problematical because there have been problems that have arisen with some private investments as well, just as there are always problems with private investments from any nationality. So it's not necessarily pointing the finger only at China, but certainly it's the case that lumping all of these together onto the Belt and Road means that there are going to be some examples of poor practice. State-owned enterprises are often perceived as acting uncompetitively and unfairly advantaged by their access to Chinese finance, undermining local competitive environments, and even exerting political influence in some cases. So there are a number of factors here, and there are a number of characteristic behaviours, I think. People coming out of China thinking like Chinese, which is only normal, and thinking that the way they should do business is the way they would do business back at home. Within China, the way to do business is to curry favour with local party officials, to take them to dinner. In the old days, to perhaps even engage in corruption. Now, these days, that's very much frowned upon in China, which is a good thing. But the cultural practice of taking people for dinner and showing lots of hospitality and building close relationships with people in government is normal practice in China. So when Chinese business people go and engage in the same sort of behaviour in small developing countries, it can appear to outside observers to be exerting power, to be acting in some sort of questionable manner. I think there are two sides to this. I think we have to understand as well the Chinese cultural side to this. But nevertheless, there have been some misunderstandings and some problems. Chinese state-owned enterprises are in some cases designing and executing dubious projects for non-economic reasons as well, deploying excess capacity that they have from home in pursuit of competing domestic state capitalist interests. The Chinese model of development, based on investment maximising output rather than return on investment, has been further observed to distort investment risk pricing and to raise borrowing costs for private sector partners. Chinese government regulation of overseas investment practices has been observed to be inconsistent so far, fairly ineffective and well below the accepted global practice. So lots of risks there that we ought to be looking at, and we ought to be carefully looking at them, but looking at them with an open mind because there is diversity on the Belt and Road. Some projects are very well managed, some where they have run into difficulties. As a new trans-regional mechanism designed with China at the hub, strengthening, therefore, its geo-economic power, the Belt and Road Initiative can, even in China, be interpreted as a challenge to the US-led world order. So this is a bigger question than just the individual projects, but it is worth us discussing. It remains uncertain, however, whether such an ambitious trans-regional initiative will hasten the fracturing of globalization into different regional world orders, perhaps one with China at the centre, or whether actually this deepening of integration into globalisation that the Belt and Road is doing, it's building connectivity for developing countries to trade more with the world, not just with China, whether it actually might reinforce globalisation against its other challenges. And of course, at the moment, one of the biggest challenges to globalisation is the United States pulling back from its enthusiasm for free trade and for the rules of the World Trade Organization. So whether the US-led pushback against China creates an alternative trans-regional initiative, is there going to be a regional world order that's dominated by America and a regional one dominated by China? This remains unclear. It's obviously part of the narrative, but it's not clear yet that that's realistic. There are, though, a number of rival infrastructure funding initiatives that have been announced in response to the Belt and Road Initiative, but with little implementation to date. Now, this is very interesting, actually, that the Belt and Road Initiative really came out of the need in the developing world for more infrastructure and the need for Chinese enterprises, especially the big state-owned enterprises, to utilise their excess capacity and their expertise that they had developed from China's development to go offshore and to expand internationally. This is all quite predictable, but it was met with resistance, as we know, from the United States and other Western countries. And since then, the United States, the European Union, Australia in the Pacific, a number of other countries in the West have announced their own versions. So while initially some of the negative comment about the Belt and Road was that it was debt traps and it was about exerting Chinese power, we now see the same sort of initiatives coming out of these other centres, more traditional financiers for development, but financiers that were not developing infrastructure. They were not investing in infrastructure enough. And so actually, this might be one of those very good byproducts from the Belt and Road Initiative, that it has stimulated the EU to invest more in infrastructure in its development partners. It stimulated Australia to do more to support infrastructure in the Pacific. So this is a good thing, I think, I believe, but actually the jury's out because we haven't seen the rhetoric of these new Western responses to the Belt and Road Initiative. We haven't seen them in practice for long enough to see actually whether they really can compete with the Belt and Road Initiative or whether they're a bit more rhetoric than reality. Neither the Quad nor the Indo-Pacific, which are these new groupings or concepts, represent traditional regions, but they are constructed in the contemporary discourse as likely to evolve to include geopolitical and geoeconomic responses to the Belt and Road Initiative. Most observers expect that the China-led Belt and Road Initiative and any Western-led alternatives will both continue to seek access to global markets. Even if the world does separate or bifurcate into a regional world order led by rival hegemons, it is unclear if these would be based on rules from the globalization era or whether they may become more mercantilist, nationalist and isolationist, which appears to be the direction the United States is leading in, but hopefully not permanently. And so we seem to be in this new mega trend where there could be the option of interbloc confrontation rather than a return to global interdependence, which of course is what China claims it is wanting and that it is supporting. There's been much more discussion of the Belt and Road Initiative in these grand normative geopolitical terms than the grounded empirical studies of actual case studies. This is partly because the initiative is only a decade or so old, and also because many of the projects now included under the Belt and Road Initiative umbrella predated it in their conception. Indeed, most projects developed between China and partner governments to progress under the Belt and Road Initiative are works in progress. So we should watch them. Infrastructure projects have long lead times and long tails. Rash conclusions that a port infrastructure project is unviable, for example, might prove 5 or 10 years later to have been premature. Chinese infrastructure is typically built for the future rather than current capacity requirements. And the same logic can be applied across the Belt and Road Initiative, in which projects are being developed for long-term rather than short-term outcomes. It can certainly be expected to reshape trade routes in the medium and long term. So my conclusion here is that actors being governments, businesses, organisations, actors will need to manage risks and find an appropriate balance in their own circumstances to minimise vulnerabilities and to maximise opportunities. So that's my conclusion about the Belt and Road Initiative. Let me take a couple more minutes just to address a new direction that the Belt and Road Initiative has taken in recent years. At the second Belt and Road Initiative Forum, a leadership summit, which is a leadership summit of Belt and Road partners, in Beijing in 2019, a green development coalition was launched with the aim of harnessing expertise and partnerships to ensure the initiative achieves outcomes consistent with the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So all of that's a lot of jargon, but basically from 2019 onwards, the Belt and Road Initiative has been recast as a green initiative, which is very interesting. UN agencies, funds, environmental ministries of partner countries and other partners are involved in this coalition, which has stimulated a series of guidelines to manage environmental risks over the life of Belt and Road projects, notably the 2020 Green Development Guidance for BRI projects, although it is too early to assess how widely these voluntary standards have been applied. In recent years, there's been a proliferation, actually, of so-called ESG, environmental, social and governance standards, by various financial institutions, governments, business coalitions and others. Some are more stringent than others, some are more results focused than others. And actually at COP26, it was agreed that the International Sustainability Standards Board will develop global baseline standards. So these problems of embedding sustainability into investments are questions for every country, and not only China, but as China is now a major international investor and creditor, it now has a major role to play in finding solutions that will include implementation of global green standards. So the Green Belt and Road is something to watch, I think, in future. Asia is still tracking behind the global average in achieving decarbonisation. Nevertheless, a Green Belt and Road appears to be taking shape. In 2020, China's overseas investment in renewable energy projects for the first time exceeded fossil fuel energy projects, and this has been the trend ever since. It's also reflecting, however, the relative commercial attractiveness of smaller renewable projects and the effects of COVID-19 in delaying some of the larger traditional projects. Belt and Road funding for renewable energy projects was more than $6 billion in 2020 and continued at about that rate, slightly growing ever since. In 2021, no coal projects were funded under the Belt and Road Initiative, meeting a pledge by Xi Jinping to finance no new international fossil fuel projects. And that has continued to be the case as far as I'm aware. Risks of building long-term unsustainable infrastructure projects appear to now be increasingly understood, at least in the narratives of high-level strategic documents and speeches. Although further evidence-based research is required, I think, to assess implementation at the project level, including how capacity constraints at the national level in developing countries impacts on Belt and Road projects. For the first decade of the Belt and Road Initiative, policymakers expected Chinese investors to simply work within local laws in host countries, but recognising local capacity constraints, a new approach to apply international environmental standards does appear to be emerging. So that's good news. With the future leadership role then of China in relation to sustainable development unclear but developing, the importance of this shift to sustainability underpins all of the questions that we've discussed here about the Belt and Road Initiative. It goes directly to the question of whether it is possible to manage risks in interdependence with China, including to seize economic and environmental opportunities from green investment, or whether actors will choose rising economic nationalism, fears of asymmetric advantage, and security-driven fragmentation into rival camps. It's something we will continue to watch.